Daf Yomi, Tractate Menachot, page 70, starting from the bottom of 69b for context. In connection to the previous discussion with regard to an ear of grain that had grown 1/3 prior to the Omer and was subsequently uprooted and replanted, Rabbah raises a dilemma. With regard to the obligation to tithe, what is the halacha of such grain? The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? The circumstances involve a case where, and now we're on 78, top of the page, with the words de'amdinhu. De'amdinhu ve'asrinhu ve'shaltinhu shatlinhu ve'osifa, brackets, ve'osifa lahu. One estimated the amount of tithe necessary, and then he separated those tithes, and then he planted the grain again, and it added to its growth. The question is whether we follow the initial growth, and therefore the subsequent growth is exempt from the obligation to separate tithes, or do we follow the additional growth and deem it obligated in tithes? Im timse loma lo azdinan basar ikar v'toisefes bo yasorei ikar mai amar yabaye ma yishno mikol chitei usorei de'almo. Rabbah adds, if you say that we do not follow the main growth and therefore the additional growth requires the separation of tithes, what is the halacha with regard to the main initial growth? Does it require an additional separation of tithes, or does it not, as tithes were already set aside for it? Abaye said to Rabbah, in what way is this case different from any other case of wheat or barley? When grain is tithed and replanted, the obligation of tithes always applies to what then grows. Amar le tov shazari kalo kole lo ni boile elaki kon boile davar shein zari kole mai. Rabbah said to Abaye, I do not raise the dilemma with regard to a substance whose seed disintegrates in the ground. In such a case, it is clear that the new growth requires the new tithe to be separated, as the original seed is no longer extant. Rather, when I raise the dilemma, is with regard to a substance whose original seed does not disintegrate. What is the halacha? Do we follow the original growth for what tithes have already been separated, or do we follow the additional growth that's still being generated by that original seed? Tipshot lemiho, Don Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Litra Batzad, Shetikno Uzarao, Misasher Lefi Hulo. The Gemara asks, let him resolve the dilemma from that which Rabbi Yitzchak said, that Rabbi Yochanan said, with regard to a litra of onions that one tithe, and then he sowed a field with the entire litra of onions. Then the field yields a crop. It is tithed according to the entire crop. Although some of the onions he sowed were already tithed, he is obligated to tithe them again because the growths exceed the original onions, and therefore the entire crop has untithed status. Hasam hainuz riaso, achelav hainuz riaso. The Gemara rejects that resolution. There, in the case of the field sowed with tithed onions, the entire field must be tithed because that is the normal way in which the field is sowed. One generally plants a full onion, and therefore the focus is not on the original onion, but on the yield, which must be fully tithed. Here in the case of grain, this is not the normal way in which a field is sowed. Generally, one plants individual kernels, not fully grown ears of grain. Consequently, any subsequent growth that fully grown from that fully grown ear is considered part of the original growth. Amar le Rav Chanina bar minyome liabaye otzitz she'eino nakuv mahu I lo nakuv ha lo nakuv. Rabbi Chanina bar Minyumi said to Abaye, in a case of a flower pot that is not perforated, what is the halacha with regard to separating truma and tithes? Abaye replied, what is the difficulty here? If it is not perforated, this halacha is the same as that of any non-perforated flower pot, meaning the separation of truma and tithes is required by rabbinic law. Dilma chazar unakvo ka'amrit. Abaye continues, perhaps what you meant to say is that he subsequently went and perforated it. In such case, the question is whether one may separate truma and tithes from the initial growth of the plant. And is the initial growth considered a separate entity? In which case, one part of the growth requires the separation of truma and tithes by rabbinic law, and the rest by Torah law. And therefore, one may not separate from the initial growth. Alternatively, perhaps, the initial growth is nullified by the subsequent growth, which would mean that the obligation of truma and tithes applies to the entire plant by Torah law. Consequently, this obligation can be fulfilled by separating truma and tithes from the initial growth of the plant. This would be similar to Rabba's dilemma with regard to an ear of grain that is replanted. Ha. Abaye explains that the two cases are comparable. Here, in the case of the non-perforated flower pot, which was subsequently perforated, it is one single sowing. Therefore, although the original growth occurred while the flower pot was not perforated, since it is now perforated, the plant is considered attached to the ground, and it rises and grows from there. Consequently, the obligation of truma and tithes applies to the entire plant by Torah law. Therein, Rabba's dilemma involving the replanting of an ear of grain, there are two distinct sowings. Therefore, there is room to debate whether or not the additional second sowing is part of the original first sowing. Boy Rabbi Abahu shiboiles shemircha bichri u sesalo korolea shema mechubar mahu kevan dimarsa tavlela ki korolea shem kodshela oidima kevan dishasna makale tivlamina. Rabbi Abahu raises a dilemma with regard to an ear of grain that one smoothed into a payol and then sowed it again and subsequently designated it as truma or tithes while it was attached to the ground. What is the halacha? Does one say that since he smoothed it, which is the act that renders produce subject to the obligation of truma and tithes, and he has given it the status of untithed produce, and therefore, when he subsequently designated it, he thereby sanctified it? Or perhaps, since he had sowed it again after he had smoothed it, its status as untithed produce lapsed from it. Amri le Rabban le Abaye im kein matzinu tchuma v'mechubar lekalka utinan lo matzinu tchuma v'mechubar lekalka. The sages said to Abaye, if so, that the grain is sanctified in this situation, we have found a case of truma that is sanctified while it is still attached to the ground. We learn in the Braita, we do not find a case of truma attached to the ground. Therefore, one must conclude that its status as untithed produce has been removed, and its designation does not render it truma. Amar le ki tanya hi le'inyan chayove misa v'chomesh de'i talish v'achal talush hu de'i gachin v'achil batla daito etzel kol adam. Rabbi said to one of those sages, when that braita is taught, it is taught with regard to truma, which renders a non-priest liable to death at the hand of heaven, or payment of a fifth. If a non-priest ate truma intentionally, he is liable to receive death at the hand of heaven. If he ate it unintentionally, he must restore the amount he ate with the addition of 1/5. See Leviticus 22:9-14. The reason there is no penalty for eating truma that is attached to the ground is that if one detaches it and eats it, it is considered detached, and if he stooped down and ate it while it was attached to the ground, he is not liable, as his intention is rendered irrelevant by the opinions of all other people. In other words, this is an abnormal manner of eating for which one is not liable. Apinaksa de ilfa. Beitze nivlas ha'oif ha'toir, miktsosem nachutz, miktsosem bifnim mitam bigoldim. Beis hablio mibachutz ein mitamin bigodim abeis hablio. The Gemara asks, in what way is this case different from the halacha that is written on the tablet of Ilfa with regard to eggs found with the carcass of a kosher bird, some of them outside the bird and some of them inside the bird? If one ate from those inner eggs directly from inside the bird, they render the garments of one who swallows them ritually impure when they are in the throat. If you removed those same eggs and ate from them while they were outside the bird, they do not render the garments of one who swallows them ritually impure when they are in the throat. Apparently, even the abnormal method of eating eggs while they are inside the bird is still considered eating. If so, the same should apply to consuming truma abnormally by stooping down and eating it while it is still attached to the ground. Talush. Avidi in ashidach lihachi b'mechubal lo avidi in shidach li. The Gemara answers, with regard to an item that is detached, meaning the eggs inside the bird, it is relatively common for people to eat even in this manner. I don't think so, but whatever. If with regard to an item that is attached to the ground, it is not common for people to eat such produce at all. Amar of Daf Yomi bar Kisna, Amar Shmuel Zareh Kilaim Ba'atzitz, She'enu Nakuv Asur, Amar Abai Bishlama Ish Ben Loike Marcus Mardus Midravolan, Shapir Ela Asur Maika Mashmilan. Rav Femnume bar Kisna says that Shmuel says, with regard to one who plants diverse kinds of plants in a non-perforated flower pot, this is prohibited. Abaye said, what is novel about this halacha? Granted, Shmuel had taught us that one who plants in this manner is flogged with lashes for rebelliousness by rabbinic law. It is well and understandable. This basic ruling, he stated, that is prohibited. What is he teaching us? Is he teaching that planting a non-perforated flower pot is considered sowing by rabbinic law? We already learned this in the Mishnah in Demai 5:10. If one separated truma from produce grown in a non-perforated pot for produce of a perforated pot, it is truma by rabbinic law, and he must again separate truma from the produce obligated in truma by Torah law to render the produce grown in the perforated pot permitted in consumption. Since this separation has the status of truma by rabbinic law, evidently sowing is in a non-perforated pot is considered sowing. Okay, new Mishnah. Achitin v'asoirin v'akuspin v'hashiboy lishual v'ashifoin hareilu chayovim b'chalo u'mitzarach min ze im ze v'esur michodosh min lifnei ha'pesach v'iktzor min lifnei ha'oimer im yishrishu koidim on ha'oimer ha'oimer matiron v'imna v'asurin ad she'avoy ha'oimer rabo. The Mishnah says wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. These are obligated in the separation of challah, and each one of them joins together with the others to constitute the measure that obligates one to separate challah. and they are prohibited due to the prohibition of partaking of the new crop prior to the Passover festival. And likewise, it is prohibited to reap them prior to the Omer offering. If these grains took root prior to the Omer offering, the Omer permits their consumption, and if not, they are prohibited until the next Omer is brought and sacrificed the following year. That's the Mishnah, and now the Gemara. Zog the Talmud. Tana Kusmin, Tana. Kusmin minachitim, Sheboy Shual Vishifon Minasoirin, Kusmin, now into 70b, Gulba, Shifon Dishra, Sheboy Shual, Shuvle Ta'ala, Hane, in Ores Vedochan Lo. So the Gemara discusses the identity of the species mentioned in the Mishnah. A sage taught in the Braita, spelt is a type of wheat. Okay, news to me. While oats and rye are a type of barley. Really? Oats is a type of barley? Okay. The Gemara translates the lesser known species into the vernacular Aramaic. Spelt is called gulba, turning to 70b now. And rye is dishra. And oats are shibole ta'ala. The Gemara infers with regard to these species, yes, the obligation of challah applies to them, but concerning rice and millet, no. The obligation of challah does not apply to them. Okay, we'll pick it up on next Amud.